everybody, and thanks for coming. We're a bit late, and we have 4 presentations in the session, so we have very strict rules as for timing. So I have to ask all the presenters to present their paper in 10 minutes, and then we will have, after plausibly 40 minutes, we'll have a general discussion on all the 4 papers. So the first one to be presented is Joshua May's paper. Hello, Josh. Good to see you again. How are you? Joshua May is from University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he is going to present a paper bearing the title Moral Rationalism on the Brain. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. So good to be here. I'm going to share some slides. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes, we can. All right.
Great.
Great.
Let me just pop it up. Okay, so I'll try to be real quick here with just my 10 minutes. And this is building on some other work in a book that I published a couple of years ago, where I tried to argue that the scientific evidence on moral psychology reveals a very powerful role for reasoning and reason. But despite the artistic picture of a brain on the cover of that book, there's virtually no neuroscience in it. So now I've been thinking a lot lately about what does the neurobiology tell us about the role of reason versus emotion in moral psychology, and surprise, surprise, I think that it shows that reason plays a crucial role. So I'll try to give you a sense of that today. Try to be real quick and give you a sense of how I'm characterizing the debate, which is crucial for how I understand the evidence to be supporting the rationalist view, or at least consistent with it. And then I'm going to give you 2 reasons for why I think that it's consistent, 2 takes on it. One has to do with the entanglement of reason and emotion, and the other has to do with domain general reasoning capacities that seem to be involved in moral cognition. And then I'll briefly wrap up. Okay, so real quick on how I'm conceiving of this debate. It's something that many of us are quite familiar with. It was a debate that was raging during the Enlightenment. And we have people on the sentimentalist side, like David Hume, arguing that emotions are somehow fundamental to morality. And in the way I see that debate, the idea is that there's something special about morality, or at least certain kinds of normative domains like aesthetics and ethics. And the idea is that it requires emotions in a way that other kinds of cognition do not. Then you have, on the other hand, people like Kant who say, no, it's not that you have some special thing going on with morality. There are just domain general kinds of capacities that can be deployed about math, about morality, but other things as well, maybe language or judgments about geography. The idea is it's just not special in that kind of way. Another way to think about this in a more modern context, the way I like to do it, is to think about, imagine we're building robots or androids, and we want to make sure that they have moral judgment, maybe so that when they're fighting our wars, they don't commit atrocities. So what do we have to do to build such robots? What do we have to include? And the sentimentalists say you have to include emotions conceived as distinct from reason. If you don't, it can't have moral judgment. The rationalists would say, well, I mean, you could include emotions, but it's not absolutely necessary. And importantly, they might say, if you include emotions, that might help facilitate certain kinds of reasoning. You just deploy these reasoning capacities. Okay, so what about the neuroscience? Well, I want to start with this idea that there's maybe a breakdown between reason and emotion in the brain. It's a very popular idea right now, and for good reason. I want to draw on 2 lines of evidence, both having to do with psychopathology. So first, let's talk about psychopaths. Now, the standard story with psychopaths is that while they do have certain dysfunction in some brain areas, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and we know that they have various moral deficits. They seem to struggle with understanding morality in certain ways. sometimes struggle with the moral conventional distinction. And they do clearly have some emotional deficits. One of the characteristic features is that they are deficient or lacking in compassion, guilt, and remorse. But as I and some others like to emphasize, they also exhibit some serious reasoning deficits. Just for example, they have very poor attention spans, they have problems learning, serious problems with learning, especially from punishment, and they have delusions of grandeur, poor recognition of emotions in others, a number of reasoning deficits that are bound up with all of these emotional deficits as well. And so even in the case of psychopaths, I think you do see this entanglement of reason and emotion, breakdown in emotion entails breakdown in reason and vice versa. But this is the idea that emotions might help to aid certain kinds of learning and inference. They might draw our attention quickly to relevant information, for example. Okay, so that's one way in which we can see reason and emotion bound up in the brain and moral psychology. Another example, classic example, is acquired damage to the VMPFC. Phineas Gage is the poster child of this, but of course, that was over 100 years ago. And you know, there's concern about, was this particular area of the brain damaged, were other areas of the brain damaged, and what particular psychological deficits did he really exhibit? But we know much more about patients who are still alive today who have damage to the VMPFC. And importantly, they've developed normally, but it's acquired later in life. They get some damage to this area of the brain. And Damasio famously called this acquired sociopathy, or at least the pattern of deficits that seem to be typically exhibited. Now, with all due respect to Damasio, this is a terrible label. It's highly misleading. These patients are nothing like psychopaths or sociopaths. Here's an example of Tammy Myers. She was in a motorcycle accident and acquired damage to the VMPFC. And you can see her here, she's extremely distressed and crying because she can't just make simple decisions about her day. So it's not so much that she's antisocial or lacking in compassion. She exhibits a characteristic feature of these patients, which I like to think of as a kind of decision paralysis. They can weigh all the pros and cons of various options, but when they have to make a choice about what to do, it's very difficult to plot for a particular option among many others. So for example, if she's at the grocery store and she's trying to figure out which of various apples to purchase, she can weigh all the pros and cons, but she doesn't have quite that gut feeling to plot for one option versus another. So this is why Damasio talked about somatic markers or gut feelings that seem to guide our decision-making. But important for my purposes, this applies well beyond morality. This has nothing to do with morality, actually. This has to do with making choices about which apples to buy at the store, or what to do, how to plan your day. So it just shows that there is this kind of way that affect or gut feelings plays an important role in decision-making generally. So there's this kind of entanglement, but it applies well beyond the domain of morality. So the gut feelings are, again, facilitating learning, inference, decision-making. Okay, so you might think this is just a dubious dichotomy between reason and emotion. Maybe they're really friends. Maybe they're all sort of entangled here. But I think this is actually good for rationalism, and it fits quite well, at least, with the classical rationalist tradition, which says morality is not special. There's nothing special about the role of affect or emotions in morality. It really just is this kind of entanglement that you see throughout all of human cognition. So it's just a feature of human beings that they tend to have these emotions that play a role in helping to facilitate inference, but it's nothing special about ethics in particular. It's just that all reasoning requires affect in normal human beings. Okay, second step. The second step by drawing neurobiology is to think about how in normal neurotypical brains, the kinds of capacities that seem to be deployed are domain general. So we'll turn away from psychopathology and look more at studies of neurotypical moral judgment. There are a number of different strands of evidence, different labs and paradigms and ways of trying to understand moral judgment, but I think they're all surprisingly converging on a very similar picture. So here's one early work by George Mull and his collaborators. They wanted to just simply use neuroimaging and try to see what's going on with moral judgment, present participants with various moral statements that they judge. They also judged non-moral statements. And then even as a further control, they did nonsensical statements. Then they just wanted to see which areas of the brain are more active when participants are making judgments about the moral statements. These are the areas that seem to come up pretty consistently, maybe among others, but these are some key players. So we'll talk more about these areas. We've already seen VMPFC, portions of the prefrontal cortex, amygdala with psychopaths. We haven't talked a lot about the TPJ. Well, that has been studied very well by Leanne Young and Rebecca Sachs. This is an area that we know is involved in theory of mind, which is a domain general capacity for attributing mental states to other people. And surprise, surprise, it plays an important role in morality, partly because intent is an important feature of ordinary morality. So they found that this area is more active when participants are judging things like attempted harm, where there's no bad outcome, but somebody had a malicious intent, and then this area is more active. That's merely correlational, but they've also done neuromodulation, like with TMS, and when you disrupt activity in this area, you do see some disruption in moral judgments. Okay, let's briefly think about Josh Green's work. Now, Green has some really controversial claims that he makes in his work, and I want to set aside his ideas that we should trust our utilitarian judgments and distrust our deontological judgments. But there's a thread in Green's work which is actually quite uncontroversial and that fits well with the general picture that we're seeing. And that's his idea that basically what's going on with these moral dilemmas when he presents us with like trolley cases is there's a conflict in two kinds of processes that are really more general in the brain. It's thinking fast and slow, or system 1 and system 2. And what he found basically is that you have these areas that are deployed in thinking fast and slow generally outside of ethics. You have them applying in the context of these moral dilemmas. So again, portions of the prefrontal cortex involved in using domain general capacities and applying them to the case of ethics. Okay, so I'll try to wrap up quickly. So what's the emerging picture we have here? It's a spatially distributed network of brain areas, mostly in the frontal and temporal lobes, and they deploy domain general capacities for things like theory of mind, assigning a value to learned act types and norms, and calculating outcomes and integrating that into an overall moral judgment. So what's the picture we have here? I think from the neurobiology or the moral neuroscience, we do have some entanglement between reason and emotion, or I'd probably put it more in terms of inference and affect. But that just shows that morality isn't special. The ways in which inference and affect are entangled is really just throughout all of human cognition. And so that fits with this traditional rationalist idea that these are just features of human judgment generally, nothing special about morality or say aesthetics. And then similarly, we're seeing that there are these domain general capacities that are being deployed throughout all these different methods and paradigms of studying moral judgment in the brain. And we've seen things like theory of mind, calculation of outcomes, and so on. These are really just sort of general capacities that we apply beyond ethics. We apply it in our judgments about language, about which apples to buy at the grocery store. So there's really nothing special here going on. It's just that there are these general capacities that are applied to the case of ethics. So in the end, I think this fits quite well with the rationalist tradition. It doesn't show that sentimentalism is like dead in the water or anything, but it does show that I think rationalism fits quite well with this, this sort of story, especially if we understand it in a more classical way. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh, and very nice presentation, even though you had to be brief, as everyone. Okay, great. And let's move on to the second presentation. And Federico Bina from Raffaele University will be presenting his paper on neuroethics and reflective equilibrium. Federico, the floor is yours.
Hi, sorry, can you see it full screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Massimo, and hi, everyone, and thanks for being here, and also thanks to the organizers for this amazing event, as always. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts about the state of health of reflective equilibrium after the neuroscientific evidence on moral judgment. And as you probably know, there has been a quite active discussion on these topics in recent years. So this is more or less the structure of my talk today. I will just introduce the idea of reflective equilibrium, and I then outline the empirical argument against reflective equilibrium, which is based on some neuroscientific findings. Then I will try to convince you, hopefully, that the argument fails, raising 4 counter objections, and then I will conclude that neuroethical research doesn't undermine reflective equilibrium, but rather it can support it and help us to build more, better moral theories. Okay, basically reflective equilibrium consists into building and justifying normative principles and theories, starting from and testing them against our considered judgments, which are judgments in which we have a sufficient degree of initial confidence. And if those principles that we have developed with this process and related judgments or the original judgments conflict, the method asks us to modify or discard or revise the recalcitrant ones until we reach a maximal coherence among moral judgments, principles, and background theories, or sets of non-moral beliefs. So this is more or less the structure of the argument against reflective equilibrium, which is based on neuroscientific findings. And the argument starts by assuming that reflective equilibrium relies on moral intuitions. Then it says that experimental evidence suggests that some at least some moral intuitions are caused by processes such as processes generally linked to the operations of the so-called system 1, so automatic or affective or model-free processes, and that these processes, being sensitive to morally irrelevant factors, would undermine the reliability of those moral intuitions which they cause, and therefore experimental evidence would undermine the reliability of a reflective equilibrium, which relies on those intuitions which are caused by these defective processes. These critics tend to endorse an alternative epistemological position to reflective equilibrium, which is what has been called philosophical intuitionism in a Sidgwickian fashion by Singer, for instance, which relies only on some philosophical, higher level, more rational intuitions which would not be affected by these defective processes or biases or evolutionary pressures and so on. So this is my very synthetic battery of replies. The first reply is that a reflective equilibrium can be conceived as not being intuitionist because, well, of course, this is a very controversial issue in contemporary moral philosophy and philosophy in general about the definition of intuitions, because there has been quite a mess after the empirical revolution in which intuitions means almost everything. But if there is something in common in between the more empirically minded conception of intuitions a la Jonathan Haidt and classical intuitionism, is the immediate and non-inferential nature of these processes. But considered moral judgments, which are the initial judgments on which we should build our reflective equilibrium processes, can be, I think, supported by other beliefs, such as the provisional reliability, which is given by the conditions under which these judgments are formulated. The second reply is that reflective equilibrium is fallibilist, namely considered moral judgments are not unquestionable or unchangeable moral truths, and the acceptance value which is attributed to them is only provisional and fallible, so they can be revised or even completely abandoned as a result of this dialectical process. The third reply, which is quite, it can seem quite similar to the first one, but the first one was more epistemic, if we might, epistemological or justificatory, if you might say so, whereas this one is more psychological, is that considered judgments are not gut reactions, again, a la Haidt, They are not flashes of like, dislike, or hurrah, boo reactions, but they are, according to the classical definitions, those judgments in which our moral capacities are most likely to be displayed without distortion, quoting roles, and which are formulated under sufficient information and reflection, and about which we have a sufficient degree of confidence. They are not biased, they are calm, and so on. The fourth reply is that the outputs of the system one can be apt and justified. If you remember, the premises 2 and 3 of the argument against reflective equilibrium states that well, some moral intuitions are emotional and or automatic, so they are sensitive to irrelevant factors, so they are unreliable. But automaticity and proximal affectivity does not necessarily imply they're being sensitive to morally irrelevant factors. And the outputs of the so-called system one can be shaped, educated, attuned, and can be further justified by appealing to those reasons which distally inform them. And moreover, we can even recognize that the response might be triggered by something that has no moral relevance, but still independently, we can believe that there might be a morally relevant element in the situation. So I think that here the lack of reliability of a response depends mostly on the inability to justify it with convincing reasons rather than on its being automatic or emotional. So this is another extra and bonus argument, which is not against the argument against the reflective equilibrium, but against the alternative position, which is philosophical intuitionism, well, which states that actually philosophical intuitions can also be automatic and emotionally driven. And if they are non-inferentially justified, their reliability is exactly as dubious as that of other intuitions. Whereas if it is supported by their consistency with other commitments, then their justification is coherentist, precisely as a reflective equilibrium requires. So concluding, experimental findings does not seem to undermine reflective equilibrium, rather they can support it, as also in the later papers on these topics, also Josh Green has said, talking about a sort of double-wide reflective equilibrium, they can support this model by firstly filtering biased responses from entering from the process at the beginning, or providing us with independent external elements to evaluate the reliability of our judgments. If there is evidence that the process which brings us to hold a judgment is problematic, this should suggest us to look for further reasons in its favor. And if we cannot find such independent support, the judgment should be revised or abandoned. And also empirical inquiry can be very useful to understand how and how easily all these processes of attunement, revisions, learning can be actually performed, and also the results from this inquiry should be balanced in reflective equilibrium in order to build more informed, realistic, and especially more easily implementable normative theories. Thank you for listening, and I hope to not having exceeded my time.
Thank you, Federico. No, you were perfectly in time.
You are without the phone, Massimo.
Yeah, sorry, Massimo, my fault. I muted you.
Oh, sorry. Because I tried to put it up, but and you silenced me. Now let's move on to the third paper. Mark Carstensen from Roskilde University, Denmark. Thank you, Mark, for coming. And the paper is on folk intuitions, free will, and chance. As you can see, the floor is yours. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. quick note. I'm from Ludwig Maximilian University Munich, not Roskilde. But the experiment and the results I will be presenting is results from an experiment on folk intuitions, free will, and chance. So specifically, this relation between folk conceptions and chance is the primary focus. This is part of a broader research program in experimental philosophy where we examine what the folk concept of free will is. And here I have said, what is the folk concept of free will really? And I will elaborate in 2 slides on what this really is meant to mean. Specifically, the question we ask in this experiment is whether the folk concept is hard incompatibilist. And this is the notion of free will that is quite well captured by this quote from Kastrup when he says that we often think incoherently of free will choices as neither determined nor random. So usually when we speak of free will, we have these 2 notions in mind, either compatibilism, which is the idea that free will is compatible with determinism and indeterminism, and incompatibilism, which is the idea that free will is incompatible with determinism. And now we have this 3rd notion, which is hard incompatibilism, which says that free will is incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism. So this is an idea of free will that has been put forward by Dirk Perreboom, Greg Caruso, and Adina Raskis, for instance. They tend to argue in favor of this notion. So the question here is, does that reflect the folk concept? So this is how the different concepts map onto different responses to vignettes that describe certain worlds. So if you think that in a deterministic world we have free will, and in an indeterministic world we can have free will, then you are compatibilist. And if you say no in both cases, then you would be incompatibilist. And the one we are interested in examining here is the incompatibilist notion. So one problem with the current research is that indeterminism is commonly framed simply as the absence of determinism. So previous investigations into folk concepts have really just framed indeterminism in this way. And here we instead try to frame indeterminism as the presence of probabilistic chance. And the hypothesis is that when this probabilistic aspect of indeterminism is made clear, then folk concepts would actually be hard incompatibilist. So when indeterminism is described as the presence of probabilistic chance, then we would expect hard incompatibilist responses. So there are 2 key methodological problems that we need to keep in mind in this part of research, and one is the bypassing effect, and the other is the intrusion effect. So these are 2 different ways that ordinary people misunderstand or misinterpret deterministic descriptions. And the bypassing effect is when they read determinism to entail epiphenomenalism, or as excluding mental causation. And the other is when participants read determinism as entailing indeterminism. And when they do this, they don't really understand the concept in the philosophically relevant way, right? So when indeterminists say that we can't have free will in a deterministic universe, it's not because they think there's no mental causation, it's because they think even with mental causation that is deterministic, this is insufficient. So ordinary people that commit bypassing and reflect apparent incompatibilist intuitions would not show real incompatibilist intuitions. And similarly, if they give compatibilist responses, but they commit intrusion, this would not reflect real compatibilism in the philosophically relevant way. So here we had 2 aims. One was theoretical, was to check if the common sense concept is hard incompatibilist. And the second, we would do this by framing indeterminism as the presence of chance. And the second was methodological, where we tried to limit and control for these understanding errors, specifically by reducing bypassing, by including explicit descriptions of mental causation. So these are how we described the three different scenarios. The first 2 is, as it usually is done in the literature, where determinism is described as everything is completely caused. Indeterminism is a negation of this, everything is not completely caused. And then we added this 3rd description where everything is a matter of probabilities with no potential outcome having 100% or 0% chance of happening. And these are the questions we use to check for their understanding. These are adopted from previous literature that shows bypassing, where we ask if a person's decisions or desires and beliefs have an effect. And if they say no to these questions, then they would show bypassing, seemingly understand the description to entail an exclusion of mental causation. And then we included this question as well, where we ask if a person could have done otherwise. This is, of course, in philosophy, a rather controversial phrase. Philosophers disagree about whether we should understand this in an unconditional way or in a conditional way. And here we included both options as an answer to control for that. And then also they could say, no, not even if her wants and beliefs had been different. This is the design, the procedure. We had a determinism, indeterminism condition and determinism probability condition. So every participant was presented with 2 vignettes, either a determinism and an indeterminism vignette or a determinism probability vignette. They read the vignette. They rated if they intuited that a person could have free will in a described universe. They gave an explanation for the answer, and then we checked their understanding afterwards. And then they were presented with the second vignette, and the procedure was repeated. So these are the results at first glance. This is if we just take the answers at face value. And what we see is that they do tend to be a difference in how they rate free will to agents in deterministic and indeterministic worlds. There seems to be a difference between how they rate agents' capacity for free will in deterministic and probabilistic worlds. And we also see an effect from this probabilistic framing of indeterminism. So this would seem to show that actually when this probabilistic aspect of indeterminism is made salient, people tend to rate the agent's free will far lower, significantly lower. But this is, of course, without controlling for the understanding errors. So this is how the participants understood the different vignettes. What's of interest here is the high presence of bypassing in the deterministic vignette, and also something unexpected but rather interesting was participants' difficulty in understanding the probabilistic vignette as a description of indeterminism, as including an unconditional ability to do otherwise. And when we control for these understanding errors, when we only look at the people who understood the descriptions in the philosophically relevant ways, then we still see a difference between understandings in deterministic and deterministic, or we see a difference in free will ratings in deterministic and indeterministic worlds. We see a difference in free will ratings between deterministic and probabilistic worlds, but this difference between how ordinary people intuit about free will in probabilistic worlds and indeterministic worlds disappeared. So that seemed to, as long as they understand the probabilistic description as a description of indeterminism, then they tend to actually say that we do have free will in such a world. So these are the main takeaway, is that folk concepts are apparent hard incompatibilist, but that this appearance is really driven by understanding errors, by people understanding the probabilistic descriptions differently. And when we control for this, we find no evidence for hard incompatibilist intuitions. So in other words, when the relevant concepts are understood as philosophers understand them and discuss them, then the folk concept of free will is really incompatibilist, but not hard incompatibilist. That's the main takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. You've been perfectly in time. So great presentation. Much stuff in a few minutes. So we can move on to our last presentation, which will be presented by Sofia Bonicalzi. I guess there is one co-author, and but she's not present, perhaps. So Sofia is going to present their paper. Sofia from Rome University, and the title is Corrective Responsibility for Habitual Actions.
Yes. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be virtually here. So I'm going to present a paper, a short version of a paper I'm writing with Ophelia Deroy. And the title is Corrective Responsibility for Habitual Actions. And as you may imagine, the problem we want to discuss is whether people should be considered responsible for the outcomes of their habitual actions, and in particular, the negative ones. But before discussing the problem, it is useful to say something about what habitual actions are. Think of absent-mindedly navigating the traffic jam, biting your nails, throwing the rubbish, switching on the light, greeting people. Various sorts of action can be performed with the automatic pilot on. And Some of such habits are really helpful and allow people to devote their cognitive resources to more demanding tasks, while others are probably detrimental to our personal and collective interest. Habitual actions can be distinguished from goal-directed actions, both conceptually and empirically, in the sense that they exhibit particular behavioral and neural patterns. So although, of course, we are aware that we are glossing over the differences that exist between types of habitual actions, we can say that overall they are computationally less demanding and effortful than goal-directed behaviors, but lack their flexibility. They are repeated in relevantly similar circumstances, and they are executed without much conscious deliberation, attention, and awareness. They can be even automatically triggered by external inputs or affordances, even contrary to conscious motivation and independently of intentional control. So although they are very efficient ways to act, and in some cases they allow for better performances, habitual actions can also misfire or even be patently dangerous. So our question is basically whether people are morally responsible for the negative consequences of habitual actions. And to clarify the type of responsibility we are interested in, we are discussing backward-looking responsibility rather than forward-looking responsibility. If you attended the talk by Dirk Pereboom, he made a similar distinction a few days ago. Another clarificatory remark that I should add is that our question about responsibility is a normative one. So given the cognitive features of habitual action, is it fair to hold people responsible? And the reason why we might not be responsible for the outcomes of habitual actions depend upon the specific cognitive criteria that one considers to be relevant for responsibility. And we can distinguish at least between two broad views of these criteria. On the one hand, we find control and knowledge-based views of responsibility. And on the other hand, we may find the so-called real or deep self views of responsibility. So according to the first, responsibility depends on the fulfillment of a control or free will condition and an epistemic condition. There are various ways of articulating, especially the control condition, as based on the intuition that the action is caused by an intention or can be stopped at will, or that the agent can do otherwise. The epistemic condition can be also framed in different ways, but the basic idea being that the agent is aware of what she's doing, both in a moral and factual sense. By contrast, real self or deep self views suggest that agents are responsible for actions that reveal their practical identity, which means their valuational system or the attitudes that they reflectively endorse. So although we mostly go for a control and knowledge-based views of responsibility, we think it is important to signal that habitual actions are problematic for both, as we said, for different reasons. In particular, for the first kind of views, the problem comes from the very same definition of habitual actions I provided a couple of slides ago, which was that habitual actions are executed without conscious deliberation, attention, awareness, that they can be automatically triggered by external inputs, contrary to conscious motivation and independently of intentional control. For the real self or deep self view, it might be a bit more interesting. On the one hand, it seems that habitual actions are even revelatory of our real self. For instance, if I have the habit of biting my nails, this might be revelatory of the fact that I am a very nervous person, and this might correspond to my real self. However, the lack of reflective endorsement one may experience remains problematic. The agent might not reflectively endorse the fact of being the type of person who bites her nail. In this sense, it has even been said that habits may entail an element of alienation and lack of self-knowledge or knowledge of why I am doing a certain action. So although the underlying reasons may differ, we suggest that in both cases, the problem is that habitual actions present a challenge to responsibility because they do not directly meet the criteria for full-fledged intentional agency. But at the same time, they appear to be significantly different from behaviors that we would more straightforwardly do not consider responsible. For example, think of reflexes, such as quickly removing your hand from a source of heat. In those cases, probably will not consider the agent responsible. And in terms of, let's say, structures of agency, he will be hard to qualify habits in the same ways as reflexes, both conceptually and empirically. So in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to discuss 3 ways of understanding how responsibility for habitual actions may work, which are reduced responsibility, derivative responsibility, and what we call in the paper corrective responsibility. And although we think that all the 3 may capture some of our intuitions about responsibility for habitual actions, we spend more time discussing corrective responsibility. So let's start from reduced responsibility. This is the easiest notion. The idea of reduced responsibility is meant to capture the intuition that habitual actions are similar enough to fully intentional actions in terms of control and awareness, but satisfy these cognitive requirements to a lower extent. In this sense, the fact that the action was habitual may work as a partial excuse in a kind of Stroessonian sense. This intuition may even match the psychological tendencies which emerge from some studies to attribute diminished blame to people for the consequences of habitual actions compared to those of fully intentional ones. However, this view has some limitations. In particular, it is unclear whether responsibility can be framed as a graded rather than binary notion. Blame can be graded due, for example, to excusing conditions, but responsibility per se might be best understood as binary. And second, it generates the sort of need to define a threshold for sufficient control and awareness for specific action that may sound a bit arbitrary or ad hoc. A second way to go is to understand responsibility for habits in terms of derivative responsibility. And we can say that an agent is derivatively responsible for something that she cannot control or be aware of at time t2, if she was non-derivatively responsible for something she could control and be aware of at a prior time t1. A standard example for derivative responsibility is that of the drunken driver. The drunken driver is non-derivatively responsible for drinking at the party, but is just derivatively responsible for hitting the pedestrian while driving in a drunk state. So applied to habitual actions, these will mean that the agent is derivatively responsible for the consequences of habitual actions and non-derivatively responsible for forming the habit from which the action flows. However, on the one hand, it is unclear whether treating habitual actions as drunken driver type of cases is really helpful. Habitual actions are often adaptive. Think of navigating the traffic jam, and subserve purposes that once were intentionally pursued. On the other hand, the empirical literature on habits questions whether agents are able to exert control and awareness over the formation of the habit. Habit formation and stabilization depend on the repetition and reinforcement of stimulus action sequences, also bypassing potentially at least conscious control and awareness. So the 2 responses we have seen so far stress that people must have control and awareness at the time of the action in the case of reduced responsibility, or at the time of habit formation in the case of derivative responsibility. The third option we discuss and argue for in the paper is that of corrective responsibility. And to explain this idea, it's helpful to rely on a widely discussed view of how to relax the standard condition for responsibility, and in particular the knowledge condition, which is a capacitarian view of responsibility. The capacitarian view suggests that the agent is responsible for unintentional behaviors when she could or should have known or acted better than she did. A standard example is that of a nurse who forgets to provide a life-saving treatment to a patient and the patient dies. In this case, it makes sense to say that the nurse could or should have done better. The problem with the capacitarian view is often to define the descriptive and normative conditions under which it makes sense to say that the agent could and should have done better. So the risk is that the claim is a bit difficult to substantiate. We suggest that habitual action may constitute a special case where it could make sense to say that in certain cases, at least, the agent could and should have done better. In particular, in the case of habitual actions, repetition plays a key role. Habits are formed through the repeated occurrence of a particular behavioral pattern. When we are performing habitual actions that are frequently misfiring or hazardous, we are especially expected to correct them once they become habitual and may escape conscious control and awareness. Repetition brings about opportunities to pay attention, learning through direct or observational errors, of course, and to exert more control over how the habitual action is triggered. So we think this idea is promising and part of the story of how and why we consider people and we are responsible for our habitual actions. But I'll finish by mentioning some open issues and implications. So this means that responsibility also depends on counterfactual, epistemic, and control attributions. Because we can have become aware of our past habitual actions and their consequences, we are expected to correct habits that are especially risky. This entails that we might be responsible now for outcomes we were not responsible for in the past. And second, it can be debatable whether corrective responsibility is another form of derivative responsibility or is a sort of non-derivative responsibility. However, what we want to stress is that it does not require that the agent is non-derivatively responsible for forming the habit in the first place. And finally, we might have to accept that people might not be responsible for unforeseeable misfires of otherwise reliable habits. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Also to you for this beautiful paper. I guess we had 4 beautiful papers and so many, perhaps there are many questions. We have some minutes. We should have perhaps 4 minutes, but maybe we'll take 10 or a bit more because we have the next session at 8 p.m. So we can take a bit of time. So who wants to ask a question? Mario.
Hi, I have a question for Sophia. So if you go to the positive case, it seems that there are not many doubts that one can be considered responsible for their good actions, even if they are habitual. Actually, in virtue theory, one is supposed to be habitually becoming supposed to act habitually well. So they don't pay, according to this view, you don't really pay attention in order to behave behaviorally good. Well, so it seems that in that case, we would say that the person is responsible in a good sense for what they do, even if they don't pay particular attention. So do you see an asymmetry here between the positive and the negative case, or do you think this is evidence that in general responsibility can be connected with habitual actions in general?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So I think it depends on whether you accept a control knowledge-based view of responsibility or a deep self, real self view of responsibility. If you accept the first, then I don't think there should be an asymmetry between positive actions and negative actions. So I would say that if you accept this kind of view, then even for the positive cases, you are not truly responsible in the same way as you would be for full-fledged intentional behaviors. If you accept a deep self view of responsibility, then of course you are responsible in the sense that this positive action reflects your real self, which is a good moral self. And I think that in this case, probably you don't have the kind of issue that you might have with negative consequences, because the problem with negative consequences is that probably you, from a reflective point of view, you are not ready to endorse that kind of person as your real self. Like in the example of biting my nails, probably reflectively, I don't endorse the idea of being that type of person. So that would be the problem with the negative situation. While in the positive case, probably I would be more than happy to endorse the fact that I'm a good person and that I'm very moral. So in that case, probably there might be an asymmetry, but the asymmetry might be even in the experience of the person more than in the requisites for responsibility. So yeah, I think it depends on the view of responsibility you accept.
Thank you.
Any other question?
I would have a question if there is time, but of course later after the others.
Oh, Sophia, please.
Thank you. So I would have a question for Josh, if I may. So thank you for the paper. That was super interesting. And I have a question about how your view supports the rationalist camp. So it seems to me that if we read, for example, Moll that you quoted, and even some reviews by Sachs, they all agree that there is no moral brain, in the sense that there are no neural substrate that are uniquely connected to morality. So in that sense, we have some kind of domain general cognition that is related to morality. But if we look at all the experiments by Green and even by Moll himself, it seems that in most of the cases, what they are able to isolate are neural correlates that are responsible for emotional processing and for social cognition, and that they jointly contribute to moral judgment, for example. So if that's the case, and if emotions still play a major role, even though in not alone, like with the social cognition part, I'm not sure if I understood how these can be used to support the rationalist claim, because the rationalist claim, as at least how you presented at the beginning, says that emotions are not necessary, are not needed for morality, that we can build this AI system without the emotional part. So if still emotions are there, although they are not the only component, I'm not sure why this is evidence in favor of the rationalist view and not just evidence in favor of a mixed or entangled view. So just that, thank you. So it's just a clarificatory question, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and good to see you again, Sophia, and thanks for your paper and everybody else. I really enjoyed these. I felt that they were all really compelling. So yeah, I mean, this is something that I think gets tricky. It's sort of definitional. It's hard. Some sentimentalists might say that, well, all I meant was that emotions, were important. It's not the only thing. I mean, even Hume says that, right? He says, of course, reason plays a powerful role, but there is this sort of comparative claim. In the end, he thinks, it's an essential role, and somehow foundational. So it's hard. Both camps seem to say, reason and emotion plays a role, but it's something about what's more fundamental. That's partly why I tried to carve the debate up the way that I did, because given that we're finding that there is this kind of entanglement, it's hard to actually define the debate in terms of, whether it plays a role or not. So I'm trying to think of it more about this domain generality and all of that, and whether there's something special about morality. But even then, like you say, that's a tricky thing too, because on the one hand, we do find that there are these domain general capacities, but also there does seem to be something like a sort of network that seems to be involved in morality. So what I want to try to show is that, well, that network does seem to employ domain general capacities, but it's also not surprising that there is these kinds of capacities that are involved, because even though the rationalist says, it's domain general capacities, you're going to find certain ones that are going to be relevant for that domain. So for example, math doesn't involve a lot of social cognition, so you're not going to see areas involved in social cognition, but that's just because the domain is different, like what you're judging. Yet we still are using these capacities, I think, that are quite domain general. I mean, even the VMPFC, you get damage to that and you have trouble deciding about apples. So just it does seem like it's a very broad thing. So it's tricky. I think on the one hand, they're domain general, but the kinds of capacities that we see are ones that are relevant to that domain. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. One more question from Sarah.
Yes, I had, I guess, a very similar question from Sophia's one to Josh. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the paper. I think I'm on board with almost all of that, but then I'm kind of a sentimentalist, so I tend to disagree with the conclusion, so to speak. So I guess, and you're right, I guess the problem is with how we define the debate. If we take sentimentalists to be emotivists, then yeah, it's easy to get them in fault and say that, well, they're just wrong. Morality is not about that. But if we think of more, I don't know, reflective or hybrid forms of sentimentalism, then they'll take reason to play a role. And I think Kant, on the other hand, would not be the kind of rationalist that would just say that that emotions are completely irrelevant. If he wasn't aware of the limits of our rational brain or capacity, he wouldn't have been thinking about the difference between the law and imperatives and all of that. So I just think that maybe we just had a very naive portray of the debate coming from philosophy and just taking, a few quotes by Hume and a few from Kant, and that's the big picture of them being opposite. And and now finally we're just kind of realizing that they're more entangled, these two abilities, than we probably used to think. And I think Green played a role in that. But I'm not sure it was intentional. So I was interested in what happens when you just make a judgment, but that's not the whole story about how you build up your ability to judge. And so, the focus on the T1, when you say that's right, yeah, of course, then you might find a kind of competitive model for reason and emotions. But it doesn't say anything about the capacity itself. So sorry, I made a very long story to just say that I tend to agree that the rationalism, portrayed in a certain way, can be useful today to understand better. But I think also from the sentimentalist point of view, if you take a reflective sentimentalism, it wouldn't make such a huge difference. So I was just wondering whether you will be on board with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, that it all comes down to how we construe the debate. And that in some ways we should probably think of it as more of a story of progress. And I really like that observation that maybe Green and Haidt, unintentionally sort of did push us to really think about these things and find more convergence across these allegedly distinct camps than we may have thought. And the only reason I think I'm not pushing the story of progress is because I'm trying to give a philosophy paper. Like you gotta pick a side, right? But the best I think I can say is that it's something like this, that it's true sentimentalism can be updated, and to me quite heavily from the classical tradition to accommodate. I think what I want to emphasize is that although maybe there is just lots of convergence and the true view should be thought of as something as like pulling from two traditions, I've just been kind of struck at how little I think actually rationalism has to update itself in light of all of this. In a way, I think the sentimentalists would say, oh, no, actually we had to reconceive and all that. I think the rationalist view, this idea that, is really supposed to be just, these are domain general and you could apply it to different kinds of topics, was just kind of overlooked, I think, in a way of framing the debate, and is just one difference between the camps is there's kind of less updating. I don't know that matters really at all, but it's some way of sort of saying that there's less change that has to go there. But I think it's quite right. We should just be pushing a story of progress, and we're getting convergence. And one final thing I'll say is that I still think, consistent with the rationalist tradition, the picture of the brain generally, and I think about the moral brain as well that we're getting, is that it is a reasoning machine. Think about like predictive processing and all that. We're not finding out that, it's like emotions as we used to conceive of them is what's dominating. We're finding out that the brain is this insanely complex computational machine. And I think that's what we're also finding in moral psychology too. So I think just that general sort of tradition is making a lot of sense of where we're coming now in moral neuroscience. But I agree, it's kind of hard to really, define these things appropriately.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Just a very small question I have for Federico. You said consider judgments are not gut reactions, and I was wondering, because most of the stuff in moral psychology and the neuroscience of ethics has dealt with certain things such as the difference between doing and allowing and that sort of stuff, or intending or permitting, that sort of stuff that is involved in trolley cases. And would you count that as a considered judgment? And what is your feeling? Is that a considered judgment? The fact that negative duties are more important or stronger than positive ones. And do you think that that is a considered judgment? And do you think that work in neuroscience and psychology has done something to undermine that considered judgment? What would you do in your reflective equilibrium with that?
Thank you, Massimo. Quite hard question. I don't know. I mean, probably the empirical research have shown us some interesting stuff about this, and perhaps we could include these intuitions in a reflective equilibrium process, as I said, if we can support their being considered somehow with perhaps some other reasons. And well, if we are not able to support these intuitions with other considerations or their coherence with other commitments and beliefs and other considered moral judgments, the effect of being somehow differences among the results as neuroscientific evidence show, I think that somehow can count something. I mean, of course, now the debate is very open also among, you know, the influence of proximity and distance and so on. So I think that now somehow the burden of proof is on the side of those who believe that those judgments which neuroscience have shown to be supported or caused by emotional reactions should be, I mean, supported by other reasons. So for now, I think that neuroscientific evidence can somehow cast doubt on some emotionally charged intuitions, such as you know, sensitivity to proximity and so on. Well, I don't know how considered they are, but we can try to make them more considered, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions left?
I have a really quick one for Mark, if we can squeeze it in.
Yeah.
Hi, Mark, really interesting stuff. Really quick about your measure of judgments about free will. If I recall, the main measure, or maybe the only measure, was, is it possible to have free will in this universe, right? Yeah. And I've been out of this literature for quite a while now, but I think another way of measuring it, right, is about, you have a particular protagonist and you ask whether that protagonist for this particular action did it freely. And given that there was, I think, some evidence that there could be differences in intuitions here about abstract versus concrete judgments, I wonder if that would be a relevant other way to try to measure the attitudes here, and it might change.
That's a really good question. So I didn't mention this in the 10-minute version, but we used only abstract vignettes here. So we did not check whether the difference you're talking about is exactly that. When we use abstract vignettes, they tend to give more incompatibilist answers, and when we use concrete vignettes, they tend to give more compatibilist. So we have not checked with concrete vignettes what the folk concept looks like when we control for these effects. And that's a quite serious limitation of the current study. It's probably the biggest limitation we have. So that's a very, very good question. So this is really only looking at one half of this literature.
Okay, thank you very much to everybody. I think it was a wonderful session with very beautiful papers. And now we have 15 minutes left in order to walk around a little bit and prepare ourselves for the next session, which will be the International Neuroethics panel devoted to ethical and social implications of telepsychiatry. And so thank you to everyone, and see you there in a minute. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.